As the world responds to the climate crisis, why are some perspectives not being listened to? The groups most impacted by the emergency are also at the forefront of fighting it. We would create much better prospects of adapting to and mitigating for the threats we are all facing if we ensure that they have the power to lead. I'm Nani Jansen Reventlow, the founder of Systemic Justice. We work to radically transform how the law works for communities fighting for racial, social, and economic justice. In this series, we're exploring 3 dimensions to the climate crisis: air quality, rising sea levels, and the cost of the green transition. And we'll see how communities are fighting for justice as the world comes to terms with the climate emergency, and ask why some perspectives are just being ignored.
The Leeward Islands of the Caribbean are now being battered by this huge storm.
Hurricane Irma devastated the lives of thousands of people across the Caribbean.
The British Virgin Islands look like they've been hit by the blast wave of a bomb. On the biggest island of Tortola, houses have been ripped apart and contents scattered for miles. An over 20-foot wave surge crushed boats, beaching them among the rubble.
It left Barbuda barely habitable, destroying 95% of buildings, and caused similar destruction on St. Martin and across islands like Anguilla, Turks and Caicos, and St. Barthélemy. Low-lying islands are on the front line of the climate crisis. Events like Hurricane Irma are no longer a once-in-a-lifetime event. With sea levels predicted to rise 30 centimeters even if there's no more increase in CO2 in our atmosphere, island communities across the world are at risk of being lost to the climate crisis, lost to the actions and failures of the global north. The Caribbean island of Bonaire is a former Dutch colony. Scientists fear much of the island could be submerged by 2050. The community is fighting back, demanding the Dutch government takes action.
I'm Danique Martis. I am one of the plaintiffs in the court case against the Dutch government. I have my own company. I do quite a bit under my company, including farming and social work. If you look at the island of Bonaire, we're boomerang-shaped. And right in the middle of that boomerang, we have a small island called Klein Bonaire, a small Bonaire in English. And the south side of the island is the lowest part of the island, where you have our salt pond, where there's salt production going on for international use. And on the north side of the island, we have the most of our hill. And on top of that, we also have the oldest village in the Dutch Caribbean on Bonaire, and that's called Rinco. That's where historically people lived among the mountain, and that is actually a very cultural rich area in Bonaire. Our nature itself is very prominent. We take pride in protecting our nature always.
I'm Onnie Emerenciana. My real name is Harolton Onnie Emerenciana, and I'm a farmer here of Bonaire. The first inhabitants of Bonaire were Indians, and later on, when they conquered Bonaire, the Spanish came, the Dutch came, the English came, and through the history, we learned that they all left things behind. For instance, my grandmother is from Indian descendants, and my grandfather is from slave descendants. I have both cultures. I met my grandmother, and I learned a lot of things about her. She describing Bonaire is, it is a beautiful island. You have to live with the nature.
Bonaire has always been on the hotter side because we are, of course, in the Caribbean, we have year-round summer. And recently what we're seeing is that our year-round summer is becoming more intense. As you can imagine, if you look at seasons on Bonaire, you have, let's say, the dry season and the rainy season, which kind of interchange with each other. So you'd call it winter and summer, if you will. And what's happening is that our rainy seasons are becoming shorter and shorter, and they're becoming more intense. So when you do have rain, it's not at all when you expect. the rain to come, and it's way more rain than we can accommodate on the island, which sounds weird. How can you not accommodate rain? But it causes a lot of flooding in homes also because of the amount of rain that we're getting versus what we would usually get spread over a longer period of time. On top of that, what happens is that our drought seasons are becoming a lot more intense. Because the rain is falling in such a short period of time.
In the early days, when I was young, it rained a lot. But last years, it doesn't rain. Another thing is, it is hot. The third thing is, the winds are very hard now. 60, 70 kilometers an hour every day. Or some periods. In the past, you have those periods like January, February, March that it has a lot of wind. But now, you can't tell when it is wind or whether not. So, if you are planting, you have little plants. If the wind is 60 kilometers per hour, nothing can last because the island is also a sandy island. So all the dust are hitting the plants, so they will die. One other thing is we are on islands. So when the wind blows very hard, all the salt from the sea is also coming into the island, on the trees, on the ground. So it becomes saltier. So salt and plants are things that don't match together. So if it's very salty, the plant will die also.
And what happens with that is that our culture is suffering because our farmers no longer know when to plant their crop and when not to plant their crop, when they can expect to rely on the rain for their crop to grow. We are very much known for growing sorghum. And if you can't rely on the rain to grow that sorghum, it's a bit more difficult. We have so much rain in a short period of time that you have a bloom of mosquitoes, flies, and everything, which brings with them also access diseases. You have higher rates of dengue coming on, Zika coming on. You also have more flies around, so you're at higher risk of food poisoning if a fly sits on your food and you're not extra careful about that. And heat stroke is something that you always have to worry about with the excessive heat. Consequences of that also comes into play when you think of your electricity and your water bill. Time and time again, the Dutch government has known that this could be a problem and didn't do their due diligence to make enough research on the islands. And they haven't done enough research to see what are the concrete consequences for climate change. How can we adapt to accommodate these changes that are expected to happen? How can we protect Bonaire against these changes also? And because of that, we find that the Dutch government are not taking their responsibility seriously of being the mother country of Bonaire, for lack of a better word. And that is why we decided that enough is enough. It's time to act now, because you don't want to get to a point where you're losing half of your island before the Dutch government does something. We have to act now to avoid losing that cultural heritage, losing our land. What we're lacking from the Dutch government is their own input into the climate crisis and their acknowledgement in that. We have heard them say, yes, we think this is urgent. Yes, we know things have to get done. We're working on it. But what they've also said on the other side is when it comes to climate or mitigation in the Dutch side of the kingdom, we're doing more than enough. We're doing more than the rest of the lands are doing. So why should we push for more? And they believe they're on track with their fair share, whereas they actually are far from on track with the fair share they have to mitigate based on what they've profited off of creating the climate change crisis. When you think of systemic change, they have to be able to take that into account and take into account what the people on the island actually want, not just what they need, because science will give you a clear-cut answer for something, and sometimes not even, right? But you still have to take into account the needs of the people living on the island, because maybe I don't want to build mangroves around the entire island, because then I still won't be able to enjoy the beach like I used to, or a part of the beach instead of covering the entire thing.
Sometimes the Hollanders say, yeah, what can we do? The island is low. Holland is also low. They build dikes. But maybe in the past, there was sea level rising. You can ask the elderly people, what have you done at that time? You can build ways or dams, hold the water out. You can put pumps in them 24 hours just to pump all the water out. There are things to do. You can do things.
Danique, Martis and Onnie Emerenciana speaking to us there from Bonaire. But of course, it's not just the Caribbean that is facing the brunt of climate change. Campaigners across the world want to hold those who caused the damage to account. Michai Robertson works for the ODI, a global affairs think tank, and is senior advisor to the Alliance of Small Island States. He's taken part in global negotiations on the impact of sea level rises. I asked him to explain what the impacts of the climate crisis look like on low-lying islands.
You can imagine, just like from the name, small, and then islands. And it just goes to the heart of the fact that most of our economies are along the coast, are basically just big coast in general, because they are islands in themselves. So whether it be critical infrastructure that we have, like our ports, our airports, our cities, our different cultural sites, most of them are actually around the coast, but any which way you look at it, because we're small, low-lying islands, even to the inner parts of our islands as well, they're highly susceptible to the effects of sea level rise. Policymakers tend to make decisions based on understanding costs and understanding benefits from an economic side and an economic standpoint. But the kind of connection that we have to our identity and our culture that will be lost, and potentially most of it will be permanently lost. We need to obviously figure out ways to bring it to the top of the agenda on solutions, but as well as figuring out how to finance and solve these solutions as we lose bits of our culture and identity. But how do we try to preserve it?
If I may ask a little bit more about the cultural aspect, because what you were just speaking to is about culture in the sense of like the way of life, the way in which people sustain themselves, the way that they connect with the nature and the environment around them. At the beginning of this episode, we listened to a case study of a particular island in the formerly Dutch Caribbean, where cultural heritage is also very much at stake. So there's monumental buildings on the island that are being threatened by sea level risings. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that kind of cultural heritage as well. What are the consequences for cultural heritage, such as buildings, grave sites, etc., that are placed on low-lying small islands? And how are people dealing with that?
It's a really live question right now. And as you were saying the question, I automatically thought about a cultural, actually a World Heritage Site, a UNESCO World Heritage Site that is in Antigua. It's a dockyard. So it's Nelson's dockyard. It's an old colonial dockyard, but it has a lot of rich history, obviously, not only from the standpoints of acknowledging the colonial past, but as well as the contributions that our ancestors had made in building that dockyard and contributing to that and contributing to the economy and the empire, the British Empire as well. And so all of that said is that it is currently facing huge issues of sea level rise. That's the long-term perspective, but as well as looking at things associated with tropical cyclones and storms, you have surging of waves temporarily. So not even the long-term impact, but even the short-term impacts are just constantly affecting that area. And the authority that is in charge of it, in charge of managing it, is having a really tough and difficult time fundraising, because it's really tough, right? Because if you think of defenses and seawalls, those are great to a certain point, but they're also not aesthetically pleasing. Also, they may not work well with the environment if they aren't done correctly. And there may be discussions that had to be had. And I know not obviously this side, but other sides have thought about relocating what we could be relocating, noting that it's a building, right? And so it might be, for example, artifacts within the building in a museum that is more protected, more inland. But obviously the building itself, you kind of lift the building and move it. And so the kind of preservation techniques or the responses that are being done is more from a more memorialization process, right? And then how do you go about taking pictures, videos, the discussion on virtual reality, so that people could potentially still, when sadly some of these structures are completely inundated with water, they can still somewhat experience. It won't be the full experience, but again, it is to try and create that sentiment and community around these sort of things. So I hope that kind of draws together an example, and the fact that all of these things need money, but also all of these things, sadly, because it's permanently lost, won't completely address the issue, which is really tough. Yeah.
We were talking earlier about the fact that you've been involved in high-level climate negotiations. In these negotiations, does the Global North recognize the responsibilities that it has?
I think it's degrees to it, right? From a very... Yes, they have. Have they done enough in relation to their responsibilities? No. So they've acknowledged them, right? Which is always like the first step. And they do it in different ways, right? They acknowledged it when they ratified, and agreed to the treaty, right? So the treaty that deals with climate change, or the treaties. And that being, actually, those two treaties are probably the top 2, top 3 in countries that have signed up to them, right? And so there is that acknowledgement. The sad thing is that how that differentiation is operationalized, like by the provision of like support and finance and things like that to those who were less responsible, has been underwhelming, to say the least, from the Global North. So I would say that while they have noted these responsibilities, they are still not fulfilling the actual kind of commitments and promises that were made to operationalize the differentiated responsibilities that they have.
So what would solutions look like? What would constitute a huge step forward in your view?
So this year, at the end of this year, we're discussing a new goal on the provisioning of financial support to the developing countries to support their climate action. Noting that we currently have a goal that many may have heard on in the media. It's a catchy one. It's also one that wasn't really based on any sort of technical rigor, but it's the USD 100 billion a year goal that is supposed to be developed to developing to help to support their climate actions. And what would be really helpful and successful, first of all, is evidently that amount is nowhere close to being sufficient to addressing the needs of the global south and developing countries for their climate action. So that number needs to increase drastically. And people are talking about no longer billions, but trillions in US dollars. So commitment to that is going to be very crucial. But I think beyond just the number, and you've seen in recent articles in the media, is about the kind of the quality of that financing, being that what are the terms and conditions that financing is being provided on? And what the current research and the current figures show is that most of that financing actually is in loans. It's actually in developing countries, even though obviously developed countries are providing these loans. When you think about it, it's developing countries paying for their climate action, but not only paying for it and paying back for it, but providing profit to developed countries, the global north, to address an issue that they had the least to contribute to.
What do you think lies ahead for small islands?
So I think ultimately being in processes like these, the only reason that, at least personally, I put myself into them is because I have hope, right? I have hope in a fairer world, and a world in which, especially, I find that the group of countries that I work with, we've always said it, we're canaries in the coal mine, right? And we also use it as a barometer of success. If small and developing states are thriving, more than likely the rest of the world is thriving. I have hope that we will start to discuss things like race, but as well as colonialism, which you touched on, right? And it was for the first time that the IPCC related colonialism and the effects that it has and how it exacerbated the effects of climate change and the connection really to it. And I hope that we're able to address these things, again, in this diplomatic setting, because it's very important, because when you don't acknowledge these drivers, then what is invoked typically is that, oh, developing countries don't have the capacity, they don't have the enabling environment, they're inherently corrupt. And because community action is where you solve the issues, because they're more context specific. So we're also pushing for that in the goal of how we get money down to the communities at an evolved level.
It is not just islands that face catastrophe from a rising sea level. I spoke to two campaigners who are taking the fight to the global north. Erika Njuguna is a youth climate justice organizer in Nairobi, Kenya, and Tatu Hey is a German-Kenyan climate justice organizer based in Berlin. These campaigners fight against the racism inherent within the climate crisis.
Sea level rise disproportionately affects marginalized communities because the climate crisis reinforces existing social inequalities and injustices. And as a result, we find that Black and brown communities, LGBTQ people, are the people on the front lines of the impacts of the crisis they had the least role in causing. I'm just reflecting on the reality that despite local communities, especially those marginalized, bearing the brunt of the climate crisis, they also bear the brunt of the response because they're the ones who are not reached by this support. I've talked about this case in Senegal where the World Bank's insurance agency, the World Bank's Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, MIGA, is supporting luxury hotels when a few kilometers away from that luxury hotels, fishermen are sinking and are losing their lives and livelihoods as a result of sea level rise. And this is not an isolated scenario in how a response to the climate crisis is benefiting the rich, is benefiting the privileged. Queer people, as a queer person, also are never reached by this support. And yeah, it's adds salt to the injury.
How much of a struggle is it to draw attention to this in some of these richer countries, many of which have benefited from the extraction of colonialism?
So I think we've seen for decades that it's a constant everyday challenge. I think the awareness is there. I think with many things in the world leaders, policymakers, executives of big oil companies, of big capitalist entities are aware of what's happening. But I think super important to be always aware when we're thinking about climate justice or injustice is that our world as it is now is just so shaped by structures of power, which is, I think we all have to understand that structures of power define everything we do in a day, defines how do I get to school or to work? How can I, what food can I buy? How can I walk? Can I walk around freely without being racially profiled by the police? Or am I living in a situation of war or in a situation of heavy environmental pollution? That these are all power structures that are causing these very different realities for people around the globe. It's really this mindset of profit over people, which is now, due to the climate crisis, very much blowing up in everybody's faces. The awareness is there of what is happening. It's just actively being neglected in the interest of profit and short-term profit for a few on the backs of the many.
I'm going to ask you a follow-up question. How do we change that?
It's about really bringing down the system and bringing up a new system. So I think in so many ways, there's so many amazing people out there who are already doing this work. I think something maybe also more for activists, which I think a lot of us are also struggling with, is how do we bring more care also into our struggles? So make that part of our struggle.
Erika, I'd love to hear a bit more about your context and your activism in Kenya. When we were just talking about the challenges in getting attention for the work that people are doing around the world to resist climate injustice. Are you facing similar challenges? How are you navigating that? Also curious about how you connect with activists globally.
Yes, I think that there is a huge disconnect between what world leaders are doing and the realities of the people they serve. I've gone to multiple COPs and engaging in UNFCCC spaces, UNFCCC meaning United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the reality is that, for instance, we now have a loss and damage fund, and we have been rejecting market-based solutions as a result of the climate crisis, which is what many global north countries have been pushing for years. On top of that, we're in a situation where this last COP, for instance, was the first time where the F word, fossil fuels, was mentioned for the first time in global negotiations, meaning that we have a global agreement to limit a global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees, but we are not actually mentioning what is causing the climate crisis. On the other side, global north countries, still disconnected by the realities of the climate crisis, are now pushing for full solutions. Techno fixes to the climate crisis, like CCS, carbon capture and storage, which does not remove emissions at scale. This is what world leaders are pushing for instead of real solutions that communities on the grassroots at the local level have been pushing for, which looks like people-led, community-led renewable energy, moving away from the privatized model of business, right? Climate action is now reinforcing the system. Taking climate action is now reinforcing colonialism, is now reinforcing class injustices, is reinforcing patriarchy, is reinforcing capitalism in itself because of these responses. And that's why we're pushing for climate justice.
When sea levels rise, many marginalized groups face greater challenges. Emergency plans need to include everyone, but some groups are forgotten. This is particularly true when it comes to disabled people, despite making up nearly 16% of the world's population.
My name is Julia Watts Belser. I'm a professor of religious studies and disability studies at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. in the United States. And at Georgetown, I direct a project on disability and climate change. And so for several years now, I've been working with a small team to build a digital archive on disability, climate change that showcases the wisdom and experiences of disabled climate activists, as well as artists and other organizers. I should also say that I myself am a disabled person and a disability activist. And in addition to my scholarly work on this subject, it's also, I have skin in the game. It matters to me personally. I'm a wheelchair user, and so that shapes very much my own lived experience and thinking about disabled people's experiences amidst climate change and environmental harm.
This episode looks at rising sea levels, which is one of the climate disasters we're seeing more and more of these days. And you look at the intersection between disability rights and climate disaster. Are you worried that disabled people are impacted more severely by these kinds of disasters?
Yes, absolutely. It feels essential to name that disabled people face disproportionate risk, disproportionate harm from climate change, and catastrophic storms, sea level rise, hurricanes, flooding, these kinds of climate intensified disaster events are a really devastating example of how that happens, and also how and why climate change disproportionately affects people with disabilities. Let's take Hurricane Katrina as an example. Hurricane Katrina was a catastrophic storm that struck the city of New Orleans and the southern United States in 2005. In the aftermath of that disaster, there was a lot of talk about why more people didn't evacuate. But what's missing in that question is a social and political analysis of who can afford to leave. So first, I think, at least in the United States, the model is you drive yourself out of town. Maybe you stay in a hotel, maybe you stay elsewhere with friends or family. There are so many assumptions baked in to that kind of emergency response plan, especially for people with disabilities. Honestly, for a lot of folks, for a lot of people living in poverty, for example, regardless of disability status, that is basically a structurally impossible scenario. For people with disabilities, when I think about evacuation, for example, the logistics are often really intense, really complicated. Navigating accessibility needs, what we often call access needs, it makes leaving, evacuating, so much harder. People's day-to-day support networks and living arrangements are often really intricate systems. As a wheelchair user, for example, my own house is arranged just so. Everything has its place in order to facilitate my own daily access, right? And I have a neighbor who helps with this and a local friend who pops by to help with that. It's very site-specific. It's very intricately embedded in a particular community and a set of relationships. So if I were imagining upending that, evacuating, leaving my place, right? That throws all of those very intricate, carefully made, often, honestly, cobbled together arrangements, right? It throws them all into disarray. Not to mention, so many folks have very specific, particular disability-related needs. So if a community safety plan, if a city, if a government safety plan assumes that everyone has access to a personal car and a robust bank account, it is leaving so many people.
I have two questions to follow up on that. One is maybe if you could speak a little bit about the root causes, like why are the interests of disabled people left out of the equation when these kinds of plans are made, or when expectations are basically formulated on how people will respond in a crisis situation. And another question is like, what would it look like to do that properly in a more just way?
Yes, that experience that you name of leaving people with disabilities out of the planning process it has devastating consequences, right? If we don't plan for people to survive, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. In terms of root causes, I think that a lot of that is baked into the assumption that, planning is often done on the basis of a kind of imagined norm. But that imagined norm leaves out so many people. I want to see governments center people with disabilities, right? Put disability at the very heart of the plan. And then you have a much more inclusive, engaging plan that will work for a lot more people. I think the question about root causes feels really important to me whenever I think about these experiences that disabled people face during disaster. I am holding and honoring the memory of so many people who I'm thinking of the story of a woman named Benelda Cacheta, a wheelchair user who lived in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina and who relied on paratransit for accessible transportation. Paratransit is a supplemental transportation system that cities and regions use. It's basically set up to provide transportation access for people with disabilities when the regular bus or subway system isn't sufficiently accessible. So it's a door-to-door van service. You schedule it in advance. Mm-hmm. It sounds great, right? But the reality is paratransit is notoriously underfunded and its staff are often overloaded. Mm-hmm. And so in so many cities and so many places, it's unreliable, even in the best of circumstances. And of course, obviously, an emergency situation is not the best of circumstances, right? These kinds of systems break down in a crisis. I often think climate change it accelerates and exacerbates already existing cracks in systems. So whenever we see a system that's sort of vulnerable already, climate change makes it worse. Right? That's exactly what happened in Benelda Cacheta's case. Right? My friend, my colleague, Marcy Roth, who is the now executive director of the World Institute of Disability, and who is herself a brilliant advocate for disability and disaster equity, right, testified about she was on the phone with Cacheta when the floodwaters started rushing into her apartment. Right? And as that hurricane advanced, Kasheta had been working for days to arrange for transportation to evacuate. And she got promise after promise after promise. But paratransit, this shoddy system, it never arrived. And so she drowned. Right? She drowned waiting for transportation that never came. This is such a devastating story. I choke up every time I tell it. But whenever we talk about these kinds of losses, we have to be really careful, because I think there's a risk that we just end up reinforcing the idea that disability is somehow inherently tragic, that certain people are just individually, personally vulnerable. That's not the story I want us to tell. I want us to recognize that this is a political story. Right? This is a story that showcases the deadly consequences of disability discrimination, of ableism, of shoddy transportation systems, of systems that are unreliable even in fair weather, and so that fail people in the face of the storm. So I think there are a lot of different ways that specific emergency response protocols and paradigms could really begin more deeply assuming that disability is a part of so many people's lives, right? Not a niche experience, not a rare event, but actually a kind of fundamental part of the way so many people experience life and a crucial dimension of our experience in community. I think the other thing I'd really love to see, though, is let's think bigger, right? One of the big mistakes that we make, I think, is focusing on the very specific moment of emergency, right? But one of the insights that's come really clear to me as I work with the stories in the Disability and Climate Change Archive is that it's not enough to just think about one specific emergency situation, one particular dimension of climate crisis, right? The impact of a particular hurricane or a particular storm or a particular flood. We have to actually grapple with the ongoing experience of chronic crisis. So many people, here I'm thinking especially about disabled people, but I think this cuts across so many different marginalized and minoritized communities. So many people experience poverty and precariousness during ordinary times. And so that makes it so much harder, so much more difficult, so much more intense to respond to an emergency situation. So making sure people have equitable access to resources, that's actually the most powerful way to make it more likely for all of us to be able to weather the next storm.
I love the idea of generally setting everyone up in a better way to be able to be resilient in the moment. But I believe that you generally think even more boldly than that and more ambitiously, because it's more than mere survival, right? It's about something that goes beyond that. Could you talk to us about that?
Yeah. Look, when you work on disasters, sometimes you get trapped in this, what's the sort of bare minimum to get people to survive? But the truth is, what we want is for people to thrive. I want us to be able to live lives that are as wide as the sky, right? I want us to be living in brilliantly interdependent, mutually supportive communities where we are looking after each other and nurturing each other, nourishing each other. I mean that actually literally nourishing each other, right? I think about the way in which so many disability communities thrive on folks bringing each other soup in the midst of a chronic pain crisis or a flare-up or an ongoing illness or just life. And I feel like this community at its best is about showing up for one another. This is, I think, how we say, I care about you, I love you, I want you in this world. Not with a greeting card, but it's like dropping by to do somebody's laundry or to shovel their walk when the snow falls. And so this kind of experience of of building and imagining networks of genuine mutual support and aid, care at its best, right? Where this feels to me like this is the way that we're going to make it through. You know, there's a powerful moment in the archive where disabled activist Maria Palacios says, disabled people aren't going to be able to get out there all the times and fix other people's pipes, right? But I think that recognition that we save each other, we protect each other. We save each other is another, it's a quote from disabled activist Patty Byrne, who says that as a reminder also that part of the work is believing deep down, like bone deep, that disabled people deserve to be here. Right? When Byrne says we save each other, it doesn't mean we pull each other out of a flooded building. It means we hold up that fierce mirror to each other saying, your life matters. I'll fight for you. I want you here. I care about you. And so we got to make that. It's on us.
Thank you to Danique Martis, Onnie Emerenciana, Michai Robertson, Tatu Hey, Njuguna and Julia Watts Belser. In the first 2 episodes, we've seen how the crisis has a disproportionate impact on marginalized groups. But the green solutions that are being pursued also have consequences. And again, it is those communities that lose out.
The wind turbines you see behind me are part of one of the largest wind farms in Europe. They're also the reason why there aren't any reindeer roaming the area of Fusen anymore. One of Europe's biggest wind power plants is dominating the area of Fusen. But the wind power development has made it almost impossible for the indigenous Sami people to herd reindeer.
In the next episode, we look at the transition to net zero and the communities standing up against governments that fail to include them in a truly just transition.
Disabled people are some of the most negatively impacted by climate change and by the policies that we're making to try and deal with it because we're marginalized in those policy spaces. And I think overwhelmingly, a lot of those working in environmental justice view disabled people as almost a threat.
Next time on Whose Planet? This has been Whose Planet, the Climate Justice Podcast, a podcast from Systemic Justice, produced by Tortoise Media. The producer was Adrian Bradley. Find out more about systemic justice and our work at systemicjustice.ngo.